All right, this is part 2 of our discussion of acid-base balance during exercise. In part 1 of chapter 11, we defined what is a acid and a base, and we talked about the sources of acid during exercise, including lactic acid and hydrolysis of ATP. We also talked a little bit about the relationship between intensity of exercise and pH production. pH drop. We said that high intensity exercise involves production of a lot of lactic acid, but you've got to do it for a while before you overcome the buffering capacity of the blood and the pH starts to drop. And we'll come back to that during this section. We'll actually look at some data about the pH of the blood during different durations of high intensity exercise. So, high intensity exercise, as we have said many times, results in anaerobic glycolysis, fermentation to produce lactic acid, and those hydrogen ions produce acidity. What are the effects of hydrogen ions, acidity, on performance? In the cell cytoplasm and in the mitochondria, hydrogen ions interfere with glycolysis, so slow down that ability to produce those 2 ATPs per glucose. Also interfere with Krebs cycle enzymes. We've already known in the past from our chapter on metabolism that the pH determines the efficiency or the rate of catalysis by enzymes. So all of your chemical reactions in your cells are catalyzed by enzymes, and if the pH becomes acidic, those enzymes start slowing down. We also know, we've talked a number of times about hydrogen ions and how they affect muscle cells. They impair the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and they also interfere with binding of calcium to troponin to activate the tropomyosin and the actin filaments for cross-bridge cycling. Hydrogen ions interfere with cross-bridge cycling itself. The cross-bridge cycles get slower and weaker in the presence of hydrogen ions. So fatigue. We talked about buffers already. We defined buffers as chemicals that can either take up hydrogen ions if they begin to accumulate, or release hydrogen ions into solution when hydrogen ion concentration goes down. They are chemicals that resist changes in pH of a solution. So there are buffers in your cells and buffers in your blood to keep the pH around 7.4, even if you throw at it some acid, for example. What are those buffers? And we'll come back to this again. Inside the cells, the main buffers are proteins. There's a ton of protein in the cytoplasm, and those proteins have side chains that can gather up the hydrogen ions produced during exercise. Hydrogen phosphate is another buffer in the cytoplasm of the cell. Hydrogen phosphate can become dihydrogen phosphate, taking up hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate ions can take up hydrogen ions and become carbonic acid. Extracellular buffers. The plasma has a lot of bicarbonate ion in the extracellular fluids, 24 millimolar to be exact. That's a lot of bicarbonate ions. That's the major buffer. Along with hemoglobin in the blood proteins, there's a fairly high concentration of protein, and those things can mop up hydrogen ions, remove them from solution, resist acidification until they are exhausted. So here's just a tabular form of it. So the bicarbonate buffering system, we looked at this when we looked at the respiratory system. So here we have a reversible set of chemical reactions. We have 24 millimolar bicarbonate in the plasma. We throw some lactic acid at it during high intensity exercise, adding more hydrogen ions. That can combine with bicarbonate ion and produce carbonic acid. Right, we're driving it, and we pile up stuff on the right-hand side. We're going to drive the reactions to the left, and so we're going to produce carbonic acid, which then, by the action of carbonic anhydrase enzyme, can convert that, break it down into CO2 and water, and increasing carbon dioxide partial pressure increases ventilation and causes us to breathe out that extra CO2. So this is a very powerful, it's called an open buffering system, because we can keep on adding hydrogen ions as long as we have bicarbonate, converting it eventually to CO2 and getting rid of it, taking it right out of the body. So we can get rid of those hydrogen ions effectively that way until we run out of bicarbonate. And we'll see how that affects blood pH. If the blood pH goes down, if hydrogen ions start to become diminished, it'll drag the reactions to the right. It's like forming a vacuum on the right side in that case, and the reactions will move to the right and produce more hydrogen ions from CO2 and water. So this reaction it's like a swing. If we pile up stuff on the right-hand side, it'll push the swing to the left. If we take away something on the right-hand side, it'll draw the reaction to the right. Or if we produce CO2 in the tissues, if we pile up something on the left-hand side, right, if the blood is in the tissues, we push the reactions to the right and produce hydrogen ions. That's why the plasma in the extracellular fluid is more acidic in the tissues. We don't really need to worry about this. It's in your textbook. Henderson-Hasselbalch equation is an important equation for calculating the pH of a solution. If you put a known amount of a weak acid and base in a solution, and you know their concentrations, what will the pH become? Well, you can calculate that, and we won't worry too much about that. What is interesting, though, and we'll talk about adaptation to exercise and add a new wrinkle. We've talked about it before, but now we'll add a new concept. The muscle cells have transporters to help get rid of the hydrogen ions that are produced during anaerobic glycolysis. So type 2X fibers have the most of these transporters, two transporters that are listed down here that can pump hydrogen ions out of the cytoplasm of the muscle cell so it can continue to work efficiently until eventually we exhaust the buffers and these transporters can't keep up during super high intensity exercise. Then they'll actually acidify the cytoplasm. But muscle cells have an ability to pump out a lot of hydrogen ions by these two transporters. So high intensity exercise adaptations include increasing the amount of those transporters and increasing the buffering capacity. We said that there are intracellular buffers, bicarbonate ion, proteins, hydrogen phosphate. We're going to increase those buffers in the presence of, or in the response to high intensity exercise. There's another buffer that we haven't talked about, carnosine. Carnosine can help us buffer in muscle cells, and also the amount of carnosine will increase in response to high intensity exercise. So trained muscle cells will have more carnosine, and that'll give us an increase in buffering capacity so that we can do more high intensity exercise before fatiguing. What about supplementation? I already mentioned it in a previous slide. If producing lactic acid so fast that we start to acidify the plasma, even though we have some buffer in the plasma, we start acidifying the muscle cells, even though we have some transporters and some buffer in there, wouldn't it be good to have more buffering capacity? Because that lactic acid, that acidification causes fatigue. And yes, it's true that consuming sodium bicarbonate or other sodium buffers will improve high-intensity exercise performance, increase the time to exhaustion. It's been demonstrated, and that's a cool thing. Why wouldn't we use technology? But anyway, sometimes it's looked askance at by athletic regulatory organizations that don't really want you to do that. But you can actually improve performance by consuming sodium buffers. You can also improve high-intensity exercise performance by consuming another, what's the word I want? Not additive, but supplement. Beta-alanine, you can buy that in the supplement store, and it'll actually result in the production of more carnosine in your cells, so that and carnosine is one of those buffers in your muscle cells. So you can take sodium buffers, but you can also take beta-alanine to help you improve the buffering capacity of your type 2X muscle cells and those high-intensity, fast contracting, highly fatigable muscle cells. The kidneys are the organs that can help control blood pH in addition to the lungs. We already know that the lungs are going to help us, and we'll review that again, help us control the blood pH by helping us breathe out more carbon dioxide. If things become acidic and we produce more carbonic acid, we can breathe out more CO2 and get rid of it. Well, the kidneys are the are important for controlling blood pH in the longer term. If you're huffing and puffing because your rate of ventilation is increased because of acidification of the blood, you can't go around doing that for the rest of your life. You're going to need to put things back into the center range, the right amount of bicarbonate in the blood. So if you acidify your blood with lots of lactic acid, and you breathe out a lot of extra CO2 and so forth, and you use up all the bicarbonate ions, well, your kidneys are going to restore that. They're going to put those bicarbonate ions back in. But that's a slower, longer-term process. The kidneys don't really contribute to maintenance of pH balance during exercise. So, just to reiterate, the acidification of the blood, the amount of hydrogen ions produced, the rate of hydrogen ion production depends on exercise intensity and duration. It takes a while for hydrogen ions to accumulate, right? If you just do a quick sprint, you'll produce some lactic acid, but it'll be quickly gotten rid of during the epoch phase. But if you keep on pushing, then you're going to eventually produce a significant amount of hydrogen ions. So duration is important. The more muscle mass, right? The more muscle cells that are undergoing fermentation, the more hydrogen ions are going to be produced per unit time, and you're going to acidify the body more. As you do that, as you increase the intensity of exercise, force more and more 2X fibers to be working, more and more anaerobic glycolysis, you're going to acidify the blood and the pH is going to drop. Even before that happens, the muscle pH is going to drop. When you increase the intensity of exercise, those 2X fibers, that's all they do. Anaerobic glycolysis and fermentation, lactic acid production, and acidification. That's going to bring on fatigue. Here's what happens to muscle pH, the pH of the sarcoplasm, as you increase the work rate. This is expressed in percent V/O2 max. It could have been expressed in watts. Same thing. Increasing work rate, look what happens to the pH of the muscle cells. Anaerobic glycolysis and lactic acid production, and acidification of the muscle cell, and fatigue. But eventually, the blood even starts to become acidic. Well, when we say acidic, we mean not very acidic, but that's a big drop in terms of physiological terms. Dropping from 7.4 down to 7.0 during the highest intensity work rates, that's a significant acidification. So that's what can happen when we exhaust the buffer. Why is this happening? Why does the blood pH stay constant for a while and then drop? Because we're going to exhaust the buffering capacity of the blood. We're going to use up the bicarbonate ions. We're going to saturate all those proteins with hydrogen ions, and then there's no more that we can do. And then the hydrogen ions start to accumulate. And that's what acid is. It's accumulating hydrogen ions concentration as you increase that intensity and duration of exercise. So again, just listing out those important buffers, and when you exhaust them, then the pH begins to change. Buffers resist changes in pH for a time, and then once they're exhausted, then the pH begins to change. So here's looking at the concentration of bicarbonate. What happens when we increase exercise intensity? We have the lactate threshold. We saw that way back when. It's when the lactic acid starts to accumulate because we're getting into more anaerobic glycolysis in those type 2X muscle fibers, and it's starting to show. We're starting to take the lactic acid out of the blood more slowly. We're starting to produce more lactic acid and so forth, and we reach the lactate threshold. Well, as we produce more and more lactic acid, we start to use up the bicarbonate ion, the buffer of the blood, and it starts to go down. And as the buffering capacity of the blood starts to go down, look what happens to the pH of the plasma and the pH of the extracellular fluids. It starts to acidify. pH going down means acidity. So we're using up those bicarbonate ions and we're acidifying the blood. The first line of defense is called, as you begin to produce lactic acid, this is perfectly self-evident, the first place that acidification is going to happen is in the muscle cells where the fermentation is happening. And those intracellular buffers are going to initially buffer those hydrogen ions. The transporters are going to transport those hydrogen ions out into the blood, and then the blood buffers will be the second line of defense. And the bicarbonate ion in the blood will take up those hydrogen ions and buffer for a time until they're exhausted. Oh yes, and the respiratory system will begin to increase ventilation. We've already seen that the chemoreceptors in your carotid bodies and aortic arch, those peripheral chemoreceptors will sense the acidification and increase ventilation rate to help us blow off that extra CO2 that's produced by swinging those reactions to the left from hydrogen ion to forming CO2. So here's a little review chart. First line of defense. We're going to start producing hydrogen ions by anaerobic glycolysis and fermentation, right, inside those muscle cells. There's bicarbonate ions in there to buffer some of it. Combine with those hydrogens, take them away. There's hydrogen phosphate in the muscle cells. Combine, forming dihydrogen phosphate, take away hydrogens. The proteins, huge amounts of protein can just mop up hydrogen ions, grab them and attach them to the proteins. Carnosine. We saw carnosine is an important muscle cell buffer that will take up hydrogen ions, and we can improve that ability by taking, for example, beta-alanine. We have transporters in the muscle cells that pump hydrogen ions out, and those transporters are induced or upregulated or increased in quantity in reaction to high-intensity exercise. It's a training effect that will improve our ability to deal with lactic acid in the muscle cells. The second line of defense, the blood buffers. Now those hydrogen ions are being pumped out into the plasma. We have 24 millimolar bicarbonate to neutralize that acid until we start losing bicarbonate ion and the blood begins to acidify. There's a lot of plasma protein and hemoglobin. There's a lot of hemoglobin in your red blood cells. That hemoglobin can buffer a significant amount of hydrogen ions. Once you saturate, though, then the pH starts to drop more and more, and you have fatigue. So that's our story about this acid-base balance during exercise. And most of the topics, I'm sure, were familiar. We knew all about the relationship between exercise intensity and duration and lactic acid production. Now we know what happens. We buffer that lactic acid for a period of time, and we blow it off out of the lungs until we exhaust those buffers, and then we start acidifying the blood and the muscle cells, and we have fatigue.